Good morning. It's beautiful day here in Namsan, day 2. Well, compared to yesterday, turnout is a bit small, but intensity of debate is going to be much more severe. Well, the session title is Geoeconomics. Geoeconomics is actually new entry to curriculums, curriculum economics, curriculum international relations. I thought the best way to represent the idea of geoeconomics is perhaps last January 2017, when newly elected Donald Trump was taking the podium and spoke to the nation and to the world. During his speech, I counted how many times he was using words like freedom, liberty, and so on. But I couldn't count anyone. And instead, he spoke of make America great again, and buy Americans, hire Americans. I thought that is the best way of vivid display of how geoeconomics is making entry. For instance, Mr. Trump is using 1962 Trade Expansion Act, which is a legacy of Cold War eras, in his dire effort to pump up support from Rust Belt. And actually, he levied 20% tariff bombing on steel and 10% aluminums, regardless of those countries whether they classify allies or foes. We haven't seen anything like this. Maybe this is the beginning of new years, beginning of new geoeconomics. So in these sessions, we assembled 5 prominent from various parts of the world who can explain what is happening and what can be done. Well, to put discussion in brief context, yesterday we spent whole day to discuss what happened to liberal international order, what is the main future of illiberal international order. And from economist, the way I can present is situation has been changing from rule-based free trade to power-based managed trade. And for instance, here in Northeast Asia, Korean saga of SARS-related trade sanctions from China is still ongoing story. And also Korea's trade dispute with the US. And US president, even though they agreed in principle, all negotiations come to an end, but he's going to hold outcome until end of summit. So I think this is a very interesting symptom of geoeconomics. And for a country like Korea, which is small and open economy, seems to be we are the biggest victim. So we assembled 5 panelists, and I will introduce them one by one. And I will give each panelist up to 7 to 8 minutes for first rounds, and then we'll have another rounds, and perhaps we can go to the floor. Well, to my left, we have Fukagawa Yukiko from Waseda University. And next to her, we have Harrell from Center for New American Security. And in the middle, we have Dr. Yukon Huang from Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And to his left, we have Walter Mead from Hudson Institute, Brett College. And last but not least, my all-time friend, Benn from Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome. So, Yukiko, can you start? Discussion.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude for Asan, and of course, as a kind of family member of Asan Institute, I would like to celebrate the 10th anniversary, which has been very much successful this year. Well, I would like to have some remarks on a couple of things, especially from Japanese point of view. And well, after all, Japan is the kind of leading, well, in time-wise, the leading countries which experienced the collapse of the bubble. So we did it many years ago, many decades ago, and then the U.S. bubble crash, and then there is a debt crisis in Europe. So we've taken enough time after the bubble crash. So what we are witnessing in the world, and some people are very much stressing about the impact is very crucial in keeping the liberal order in in the world. But well, as a result, we have been lots of difficulties, and I think let's make our country great again is a very common phenomenon in kind of G7 kind of countries. Well, Canada and Australia might be a kind of exception because they can depend wholly on resource export, but the rest of countries are getting quite similar. So what Mr. Trump seems to be trying to do is quite similar with what we've done. So we have to, since we are exposed to the competitions from emerging or developing countries, so let's improve our competitiveness. So let's cut out the corporate tax. So let's adjust the exchange rate. So we have to review the FTA whole regime. These are things that are quite common, not between Japan and US, and also as well as some part of Europe. So that kind of mentality seems to be quite similar, but after a whole kind of different kind of turmoils, we just came to the conclusions that after all, the basic things will never change. So we have to wind up all the innovation system to push up the productivities, and that's the only way that we can survive. So that's why we've been becoming more serious on the labor reform these days, and that's our story. So still, in that sense, we have a kind of rather naive expectations on the free trade. So that's why we put enormous political capitals into TPP on one hand. On the other hand, we are pushing this year, especially to counterbalance the TPP. We are pushing the ideas of RCEP, ASEAN plus Japan, Korea, China, and India, Australia, New Zealand. So if these groups will be quite successful in reaching certain agreement, we have our portfolio, FTA portfolios, is just probably to have two different kinds of trade pact. One is a TPP that's a very high standard, very revolutionary. Well, it's getting older actually, but it's a kind of revolutionary content. And on the other hand, RCEP member, probably the liberalization standard might be ended up in a lower standard than TPP, but still these emerging countries continues to grow much faster than the TPP members. So there are some duplications between TPP and RCEP, but we do hope all these efforts to continue to sustain the free trade is going to work. At least in Asia Pacific. That's our thinking. So we can be very negative about the future of free trade, like sharp power, but China, we all know that China still needs desperately the growth, sustainable growth, and China is also very much sometimes attracted by the ideas of using sharp power, but on the other hand, they are naively still believing the value of trade because they've experienced that growth dependent on trade. So we are not necessarily be so much negative about the future of free trade. So the global regime like WTO or G20, although it has got weaker probably than before, but still we desperately need the global regime. Without the WTO, there's no dispute settlement. Without the WTO, there's most favored nation at all. So WTO will continues to survive. And then bilateral pact, probably pushed by Mr. Trump, is going to prevail. But what bilateral trade pact can do is very much limited. Our whole global supply chain is very much stretched out, so we have to have a common rules across the border of many countries, and that's the major strategic interest by Japan, and that's why we so much sticking to the values of plurilateral pact rather than the bilateral pact. And there seems to be a kind of domino. If Korea comes to TPP, that means the very high standard of Japan-Korea FTA, and then Korea has already a FTA with China. Then we have to adjust the trilateral pact among Japan, Korea, China. So in this way, we do hope that the competitive liberalizations is going to continue to sustain the global regime. And in relations to the sharp powers as well as the LIO, I think several agendas in TPP that is to adjust the competitive environment with the state capitalism or the exchange rate interventions, and those new agendas have never been talked in the WTO. So I think still there should be a new agenda that we can talk, and even those sharp power group must be very much interested and participate in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, Yukiko, you mentioned how important TPP 11, but as we all know, when US was pushing forward TPP, they were saying that, at least the domestic audience, this is about which countries are writing new trade rule for 21st century. So I thought that is one interesting case of using geoeconomics. But now US is gone. But I think one thing Japan did remarkably was Japan saved TPP in the name of CPTPP. And perhaps there was, no one was expecting, but that happened. And now we have CPTPP about to be effective soon. But US was, Trump is under pressure because of unseen development. In this regard, I have questions. Perhaps you can respond later, but I'll give a question anyway. That is, well, from the day one, US is pushing Prime Minister Abe about idea of bilateral FTA between Tokyo and Washington. But Tokyo has been resisting about ideas. But to me, because Japan was able to suppress all these organized farming sector's interest, then I don't think any reason not to embrace the idea of bilateral FTA. And if that has happened, it is the same thing as extension of TPP. So perhaps you can respond to that question later. Okay. Yeah. Now, can I call upon Peter?
Of course. Thank you very much to the Asan Institute for having me here today. This is my first time at the plenum, and I have to say it's been a remarkably fulsome discussion, and congratulations to Asan for putting it on. I was going to focus my remarks on a particular aspect of geoeconomics, and that is the use of economic tools to advance geopolitical and strategic foreign policy goals. Under that part of geoeconomics, I think the first thing I'd note is that it's important to keep in mind that basic part of geoeconomics, the use of economic tools for strategic ends, has existed before the liberal international order, has coexisted within the liberal international order, and I'm sure will exist in whatever succeeds and comes after the liberal international order. Just to give a couple of examples showing how geoeconomics has existed before and during the liberal economic order, thinking broadly the sort of post-World War II era to present. Clearly, if you look at the history of US FTAs, they've been used within the liberal economic order as a geoeconomic instrument. The very first modern US FTA was with Israel in 1985. That was not because of sort of the economic relationship with Israel. That was very much because of the strategic relationship. Similarly, if you look at the series of FTAs in the 2000s, US FTAs where they really grew, many of them were with Middle Eastern countries like Oman and Morocco. Again, not because those were the major rising trading powers of the world, but because this was the era of post 9/11, of the invasion of Iraq, and then President George W. Bush was looking for ways to strengthen alliances with key partners. Obviously, the Russian sort of pipeline politics from its side existed throughout the post-war era and continues today. Similarly, the kind of coercive side side of geoeconomics existed within the liberal international order from its very foundation. I do a lot of my scholarly research on economic sanctions, and economic sanctions are actually a very old tool, going back to at least ancient Greece, if not before. The U.S. first started using sanctions in 1807, when the U.S. enacted an embargo on France and Britain during the Napoleonic War. Sanctions were also clearly contemplated within the very foundation of the liberal economic order. They'd been used as a tool during World War II, and if you go back to the very first round of the GATT negotiations in Annecy in 1947, already you had the development of Article 21, which creates a clear carve-out from GATT obligations among the original 23 members for national security related sanctions. So I think the first thing to note is that when we talk about geoeconomics and the rise of a lot of new geoeconomics, what we're really talking about is the rise of geoeconomics as practiced by players who do not exist or do not see themselves within the liberal international order. Because within the liberal international order, as I say, we've been doing this since the foundation of the liberal international order. What do I see as some kind of trends and patterns in modern use that differentiate kind of modern use last decade, last 15 years, from the period of kind of the post-war era to the 2000-2005 era? And I'd say first, we definitely see a rise in the number of players. I think here in Seoul, when you think about geoeconomics and new players, we think a lot about China, and that, of course, has become a leading player of geoeconomics. But if you look around the world, you're seeing Russia doing it. You're seeing Saudi Arabia and the UAE enacting sanctions on Qatar as part of that dispute. You're seeing Russia enacting them on Turkey, sort of outside of the Western-Eastern conflict there. And I think we're going to see more and more players enact sort of coercive geoeconomic measures going forward. I think the reason we're seeing an increased use in geoeconomics is pretty simple. A lot more states have capacity to engage in geoeconomics. I think the greater interconnectedness of the global economy combined with the rapid growth economically of a number of new players just give a number of these players capacity that 20, 30 years ago they didn't have to engage in geoeconomics. No one would have worried about Saudi Arabian sanctions 40 years ago. They simply didn't have the clout to do so until they kind of showed us we did with the oil embargo. I think today we're just seeing a larger number of players. I think we're also seeing significant changes in how states are implementing their kind of I should say the other major reason I think we have an increase in use is not just sort of interconnectedness. There's a particular piece of that which is the rise of sovereign state wealth, which gives government, that is readily deployable overseas, which I think gives governments a new and more flexible tool than they had in the past. Today sovereign wealth funds alone control about 7.5 trillion of assets. That's out of a global asset base of maybe 250 trillion. So it's a small share, but it's a useful share and a growing share. And that doesn't include the huge presence of state-owned enterprises in places like China, which give countries like China a huge amount of ability to implement geoeconomic measures. In terms of how we're seeing shifts in use, well, first, as I said, traditionally they've been used within the liberal international order, typically against states that are not part of that, or at the very least authoritarian states, whereas increasingly we're seeing use by authoritarian states against democracies. It's interesting, if you look at the cases of Chinese coercive economic measures since 2010, we at CNAS are about to put out a study on this. Every single one of them has been against a democratic state. I think that has to do with kind of not China being anti-democratic, but with the but with kind of who China has disputes with. But is an interesting trend, nonetheless. The next big sort of difference we see is that on the inducement side of geoeconomics, the sort of trade agreements, development assistance, that kind of thing, when the U.S. was the leading practitioner during the liberal order in the post-war era, we typically used our geoeconomic inducement tools to reinforce aspects of the liberal international order. They were things like free trade agreements, where it is a strategic inducement, but it is also the nature of an agreement that promotes free trade. When you look at what China's tools look like, Belt and Road Initiative and other tools, much less clear that they reinforce the values of the liberal international order. So I think we see a sort of a shift in terms of how these tools are being used, and the fact the rising powers tend not to use these tools in ways that also reinforce the liberal international order. Third major difference, and I think you see this particularly with China, when the U.S. used geoeconomic instruments, Western Europe, we tended to do so transparently. Even when the U.S. used sanctions and other coercive economic measures, the U.S. had a declaratory policy about them. They put them in laws and regulations, and it was sort of an acknowledged deviation that existed from liberal trade rules in order to serve a political objective. It's not at all how China uses the coercive side of its geoeconomic tools. It does not have a sanctions law. They are about to enact a trade controls law, but they don't have a sanctions law. Instead, China has used a series of sort of covert and not formally disclosed regulatory and informal measures. And I think that poses a different kind of challenge to the liberal international trading order than the way in which the U.S. Has used and continues to use geoeconomic tools. In terms of whether this rise of geoeconomics represents a threat to the liberal international order, I think it does to a degree. It's probably not the biggest threat to the liberal international order we face today. I think kind of the U.S.-China trade dispute and kind of the personalities and governance of Donald Trump and Xi Jinping probably pose a larger threat to the liberal international order. But clearly these geoeconomic tools do pose some threat, particularly if we were to see a situation where we had kind of an escalating tit-for-tat arms race between the U.S. and China, in particular on geoeconomics, in a way that could really, I think, begin to pull apart some of the basic foundations of the liberal international order. Thank you again.
Well, thank you, Peter. As Peter rightly mentioned, geoeconomics is not actually the totally new phenomenon, but during Cold War eras, certain sort of geoeconomics was manifested. For instance, you said when U.S. was selecting free trade agreement partner countries, very, very much based on value-sharing countries and so on. But I think the new seismic shift is those old concept is giving away. For instance, when Korea was having FTA negotiation with the U.S., many Korean side was taking great pride, the symbol of consolidating two countries' alliance. But new president came in and he was even threatening terminate Korea's FTA, while the North Korea was accelerating nuclear adventurism. I think that is a totally new phase and new aspect. So how U.S. global economic policy, that aspect is going to be duly affected. For instance, when I was taking a look national security report and national economic report and so on, then they all try to link with economic issues with security issues. So it looks like economic issues are subject to security concerns, regardless of whether we stand with them or not. So perhaps you can further elaborate those questions. Now I'll give floor to Yukon.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Asan for inviting me here. It's the second time. I'm particularly pleased because they've given me a papal dispensation. They've allowed me to use some slides. Okay, I'm a visual economist. If I cannot get my point across with a picture, it's actually too complicated to speak to an audience about it. So I want to get across some very complicated ideas fairly quickly and simply. Let's first begin with the view of what we mean by geoeconomic sanctions. So on the bottom, and I focus on China, China practices unilateral sanctions. It's driven by three issues: core interests, security, Taiwan, Tibet. You hit those subjects, China wants to express an opinion. What are these sanctions? Well, first, they're of short duration. They last from 1 to 2 years. They're focused. They're expressing a message because China does not think it actually could solve the problem. That's what is happening. And then if you look above that box, there are two sets of forces driving these measures, what I call drivers and modifiers. What is driving China's use of economic sanctions? Its economic rise, gives it its power, its assertiveness to do so. But it uses these measures because it lacks soft power. If it had soft power in institutions, it would actually be using this as much as a normal great power would do so. Let's go to the modifiers. What can one expect if you want to talk about modifying China's tendency to use these kinds of sanctions? You have to go back and ask, what is China's aspirations at this moment in time? It wants to be a great power. It wants to be seen as a leader. It wants to be seen as credible, whether it's on globalization, climate change, One Belt, One Road. And it realizes, however, that the world is very apprehensive about its rise. So the interaction between the apprehension of the regional players, China's desire to create a greater role, that's potentially the modifier. And it goes back to a concept that Deputy Secretary Zellick posed many years ago of a responsible stakeholder. It's coming back into a discussion in China. If it wants to be a responsible stakeholder, the use of sanctions doesn't work. So let us go on to talk about what do we mean by China's economic rise. 200 years ago, China accounted for 35% of global GDP. Enormous. It fell steadily. By 1980, China's share of global GDP was only 2%. It's now risen over 30, 40 years, 10% a year, compounded 18% of the world's production in purchasing power parity terms. Equivalent to Europe and the United States, it is now the largest economy measured in purchasing power parity. It will be the largest economy measured in nominal dollar terms in probably 10 years. But in the book I wrote, I talk about this rise as abnormal. I call China the abnormal economic power. It's the first developing country which is an economic power. It's the first returning power. History, insecurities, institutions, the nature of these are different in China. It will exercise in a different way. Let's talk about what the economic rise, how does it affect countries? Only in three ways: trade, connectivity, foreign investment. The regional production sharing network is a natural look eastwards. It builds complementarities with Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore. It draws on the resources of the Middle East, but it's largely eastward oriented. That's the production sharing network. It builds complementarities. The One Belt, One Road looking west. This is the concept of China as the Middle Kingdom. For a Middle Kingdom, you have to be in the middle. You have to look both east and west. And that is what the One Belt, One Road is doing. That is building leverage. And we had many sessions talking about that, whether it's going to be positive or negative. But you must also build a global presence. And the global presence is foreign direct investment, project financing aid. 15 years ago, 75% of it was in Asia. Today, only 40%. It now extends to all the continents in roughly the equal proportion. So China builds a global presence. So you have the geographic focus expressed in three different instruments. China also aspires for the RMB to be a global currency. It thinks through the petrodollar and other means that it will become powerful in this respect. This is not possible. It's not possible because China has capital controls. But more important, how did the dollar become the global currency? It became the global currency because America runs huge trade deficits and pays in dollars. China runs surpluses. There's no way for the RMB to get out there. So for all practical purposes, the RMB cannot be a global currency. It's not going to be a relevant issue. But trade patterns are. And let's look at the trade patterns. So here is China's trade. Share of global trade, a steady rise, so it is now the world's dominant trader. This builds the complementarity, builds the linkages. China is the #1 trading partner of 40 countries. It's the second or third of another 100. This is also a vulnerability. You disrupt the global trading network, you hit China. But China is rather unique. Not only is it the world's largest trading nation, increasing it, its dependence on trade is actually falling. Is that diagram up there? Yes. China's share, trade of global GDP, of its own GDP, hit a peak of 70% 10 years ago. It's now down below 35%. It's very much becoming like a US. Only these two economies are global economies that have both a global presence in trade, but self-sufficiency that gives you room to maneuver. And we've not fully understood this. Countries like Korea, other countries are still globally dependent. But China is now becoming less so, even though its share of global trade is increasing. This pattern is China's trade balances with most of the regions. If you look at this very closely, it correlates precisely with the degree of tensions that it has with the rest of the world. So you begin with US at the very top, huge trade surpluses with America, still increasing. Trade surpluses very large with Europe, but moderating. Trade surpluses with South Asia, India, increasing dramatically, a source of tension. At the bottom, a trade deficit with East Asia, Australia broadly defined, which used to be huge, but is now moderating. And that is why East Asia now begins to wonder whether China is an opportunity or a risk, because it's no longer such a trading source of growth. The rest of the world, you can see, is cyclical. Depending upon commodity prices and flows, China is either a surplus or a deficit country. Now, this structural relationship is unique. Only China has this kind of a structural relationship. It generates a lot of what I call the tensions in the world. And if we understand that fully, we can actually predict how it's going to evolve. This is China's trade in manufactures and in services. So the top diagram shows you its share of manufacturing in 6 major product lines, of which I draw attention to electronics. That's where the technology is. And you can see how China has become the dominant exporter of electronics and electrical products. And that, however, building upon components made in Korea, Taiwan, elsewhere. So it exaggerates China's technological progress. But you see how sharp that is. Now, the other thing to see is the G7 are the losers. All the G7s. Their share of manufacturing in every case falls. But that's not true for the rest of the world. ASEAN, Korea, most emerging markets, their shares have actually increased or stayed level. So there's a changing role in terms of global trading manufacturers. And this also will help one understand the role of trade wars and tensions and how it's going to be influenced. But actually the more important neglected slide is the bottom one, services. That is actually the source of strength. It gives America the great power. China is not very good in the export of services. It's risen, but it's very, very modest, way below the normal. Now, of these services, of which there are a variety, the one that really matters is the orange one, service exports financial. And there you see America's dominance. No other country has such a dominant role in the global presence of financial services. And this is why, of course, that America can exercise economic sanctions, and it's so powerful. Now, these two diagrams, the current trade wars focuses on the top, the manufacturing industry. Very few people focus on the bottom, the services. But if you actually look at the manufacturing and the services, US-China relations, there is potential actually for win-win solutions if both sides could see it, but they don't see it. And so the debate is about manufacturing, but the real issue is actually about services, and we don't have enough attention on services. Let's talk about technology wars, and that's what you see in terms of what the US is actually talking about. This is a diagram of a country's ability to adapt technology developed in the West and to use it productively. And the World Bank has created an index for this purpose. And what you see is over the last several decades, China is in a class by itself. We've never seen a country that was able to get the technology from other countries in the West and to make it useful profitably. And you do it through trade, you do it through foreign investment, you do it through patenting, you do it through licensing, you also do it through stealing. So this is the Section 301 violations. Every year, America has a Section 301 list, and it certifies countries as violators. So what I've done in this diagram is plotted the key violators over the last 10 or 20 years. And there we see Korea, we see Taiwan, we see Japan. Now, what we see is a very strong relationship. Who are the countries that steal or violate or are seen as being unfair in technology transfer? And when you go through the list of countries, because all the countries are on there, what you see is only successful, rapidly growing developing countries steal. And the second point, it stops. It stops at a per capita income level around 18 to 20,000, every single case. Why? Because the forces and incentives for either stealing or protecting changes. China is far away from that. Now, we underestimate actually the power of theft as a development weapon. It's very under-exaggerated. And it's actually going to increase. It's going to increase because the returns to innovation and technology development have declined globally, whereas the costs of generating productivity increases from technology have increased, making theft and the abuses of theft a big issue. So the last point, I would just say, going back to my first diagram, are we going to see a world where there's greater tensions, greater use of what I would call geoeconomic instruments? It's the right-hand question of the modifications, the moderators. For those who argue for engaging in China, then there's the possibility of lowering the tensions. And today, fewer and fewer people believe in engagement. They see China's rise as becoming a really negative force. For those who believe in the containment aspect, operating on the right-hand side, then what you see is a natural increase in the likelihood that tensions will persist. Let me just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Yukon. Your graph is very interesting. Are you trying to say China will keep cheating until the per capita GDP is going to hit the level of advanced countries?
If history is
Hopefully
any
not.
guide,
Uh-huh.
if you look at Korea, you look at Japan, you look at Taiwan, they all were sanctioned. They all were on the 301 list. They all stopped at a certain point in time. And you see this is a very strong indicator, and the reasons are fairly obvious. Right now, 50% of the cases in China are Chinese suing Chinese. 10 years ago, there were 80% cases were against foreigners. In another 10 years, 80% of the cases will be Chinese suing Chinese. IPR protection will become a much more, what do you call it, strong incentives for China to protect it.
Yeah, perhaps we can come back to later. Peter and Ben can join this debate. Walter? Yeah.
Okay, well, again, I'd like to thank the Asan Institute for inviting us all here and for giving us a really terrific opportunity to learn. When it comes to talking about geoeconomics, I would very much agree with other panelists who've said it's very old, it's always been here. In terms of the relationship of geoeconomics and the liberal international order, I'd simply point out that the liberal international order is an example of geoeconomics at work. The sense that the Marshall Plan, U.S. working to bring the Europeans together into the iron and steel community, ultimately the European Union, this was all very much conceived as the economic dimension of a grand strategy of containment. The liberal, to make a dichotomy between liberal international order and geoeconomics is to make a significant error. So the question, and therefore it would also become, I think, clear that if the liberal international order is under stress or no longer perceived to be working as effectively, then there will be geoeconomic responses to that, economic policy which played such a large role in the shaping of the liberal international order would be called on and adjusted in some ways if one were to try to reform or in some cases perhaps abolish or overturn that order. Well, how can we think about this exercise of geoeconomics, which has been so influential? And I say the post-1945 and post-1990 U.S. adaptations of geoeconomic tools to national strategy are part of a family of geoeconomic strategies that were really pioneered by Great Britain in the 19th century. And it was this idea of, sort of a contrast to the Spanish and Portuguese empires, where the Spanish and Portuguese said, okay, this is our empire, we conquered it, any trade that goes on, the benefits go to us. And the British, with the Pax, when the British adopt the idea of free trade, they said, no, we're going to operate a global system, and then other countries can participate in that system and also grow rich. And the hope, obviously, would be that other countries getting rich would have fewer incentives to try to attack British power. Why would you try to destroy something which was providing so many benefits to you? It actually worked pretty well in terms of UK-US relationships. To some degree, it worked pretty well ultimately with British-French relationships. It didn't work out in the case of Germany, where Kaiser Wilhelm II, whose country became immensely wealthy and powerful and influential as a result of its participation in this global trading system that the British had set up. The thought is, no, we don't want to be a responsible stakeholder in the British system. We want to be, Deutschland über alles. Germany must be number one. And so they went to war to overturn the system with all the power and wealth which they had accumulated through decades of peaceful participation in it. And this is where the Germans discovered the kind of sting in the tail that during those years in which the German economy had grown so wealthy based on its global investments, its global trade, it had become dependent on, for example, raw materials, rubber from British-run Malaya, buying food from Argentina and the United States. And so the world system was not only the source of Germany's strength, it was a source of vulnerability which the British and the Allies then exploit in World War I. And in many ways, that slow tightening, the economic blockade, both shaped German strategy and ultimately played a major role in Germany's defeat. So this is, if one sees the United States, then World War II, by the way, there were the American strategy against Japan, Japan's counter strategy were both geoeconomic and resource-driven in the way they were shaped. And the same in terms of Germany. Why was Hitler's army in Stalingrad in the first place? Because it needed to get oil from the Caucasus, which it could no longer obtain thanks to the British blockade from other sources. So, geoeconomics has been a central, one might even argue in some ways the central historical driving force behind geopolitics for a very long time. What does that mean today? It's all very interesting for the past. What does it mean for today? And I think what we can clearly see is China, the American post-1945 adaptation of the British strategy worked rather well with Germany and Japan and the rest of Western Europe, South Korea, and many other countries who are now responsible stakeholders and strong partisans of that international system. And if the United States tries to deviate from it, these countries are trying to pull the United States back into its own system, so to speak. That's success. China is in a somewhat different position. And China is evaluating, I think, the future benefits. Clearly, for now, the responsible stakeholder option has waned in Chinese thinking, and the ghost of Wilhelm II is beckoning. You were strong, you were rich, your hour has come. And so you see people beginning to look. What one needs to understand, I think, is the immense difficulty of countering this maritime strategy. China is working very hard on, say, denial of area for the U.S. Navy in the immediate waters around China. That's a commendable objective from a Chinese point of view, no doubt. But it doesn't do a lot about getting raw materials from other parts of the world thousands of miles away to China. And any Chinese effort to build a naval fleet and military force projection capabilities that were able to give China a security of supply and market around the world would be of such a dimension that it would alarm neighbors, alarm even a United States which was weary of Asia, because the scale would be so immense, the armament drive would be so overwhelming. And we can already see in a fairly, in the fairly mild stages of Chinese questioning of its role in this geoeconomic system, we've seen a great deal of enhancement of links among countries like Japan, Korea, Australia, India, Vietnam, and others who see a real threat to them, even in the nascent presence of Chinese force projection outside of its immediate era. So, the Chinese read history too, and have no desire, Xi Jinping has no desire to retire to Holland in old age and cultivate tulips the way the Kaiser did. And so we can look at things like One Belt, One Road, in part can be seen at trying to shift a geoeconomic competition. The big change in the last 500 years was the Portuguese Revolution, when the Portuguese disintermediated Eurasia in terms of Europe's trade with the rest of the world by going around the Cape of Good Hope and entering direct trade with India, with the East Indies, China, and so forth. One Belt, One Road would try to get back to the time when land transportation across Eurasia was the best means and cheapest means of getting trade across, and so reduce the advantage of control of sea power. And if you look carefully at maps of One Belt, One Road initiative, you can see in many ways at least in design, if not always in execution, it is an effort to reduce China's vulnerability to the kind of sea power that undergirded British and American power. What has China been asking the United States for? Interestingly, it's something very much like what the United States asked Britain for and got, the Monroe Doctrine, where Britain, by the late 19th century, gave the United States a free hand in the Western Hemisphere. Japan actually asked Britain for a Monroe Doctrine for Asia. This was the Japanese request in the early part of the 20th century. It was what Hitler offered in his peace terms in 1940. Give me Europe and you can keep your empire. So China's ask in that sense is a kind of a new Monroe Doctrine for Asia, something that perhaps sounds better in Beijing than it does in Tokyo or Seoul or a number of other places that don't envy the consequences of that Monroe Doctrine. And this, I think, gets us to a great frustration of Chinese foreign policy, and one that is a bit of an issue inside China politically. We often speak of the three revisionist powers who were bringing geopolitics back onto the scene. Of the three, Iran, Russia, and China, there's simply no doubt that China is the power with the greatest economic potential, that China is the greatest, is the most serious of all of these as a contender for world power. And yet, of the three, Iran has had far more success in changing the international situation around its frontiers. And Russia, while not quite as successful as Iran, has been pretty successful in changing the political situation around its frontiers in Europe. And China has had less success. Building artificial islands on the South China Sea is let's do a fist pump, but it's not the same as sort of, Iran's ability to kind of reach Lebanon in a corridor of Iranian forces or this sort of thing. The reason is that the resistance to Chinese ambitions in this part of the world is stronger because the state system around China is stronger. That is, Iran is confronting weak, decaying states in most cases. Russia Ukraine is many things. It is not a terrific example of state building. Russia has a bit of a vacuum, as does Iran. China has the opposite. South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Australia, these are some of the world's most successful states, in part because the liberal international order has redounded so much to their benefit, and they've learned how to capitalize on its assets so well. So I would argue that geoeconomics is very much influencing the U.S.-China relationship and the international domain, perhaps in ways that may be somewhat more conducive to stability than some of us sometimes recognize. I would simply close, I think, by noting an important trend that I think came out some in your data in terms of services, that this geoeconomics has, since the 19th century, been very much interested in information. And part of the sea power was a quicker way to get information about the rest of the world. Sea power was a faster way to move your forces. Britain could move its forces in ways that other powers couldn't for many years. But information, the control of the cables and telegraph lines of the 19th century, was a major British strategic objective, so that you can have the cables always passed when they hit land on British-controlled territory, meaning that your communication network was global and secure, that other people's was not. And the first actual shots fired in World War I were fired by British ships stationed in Australia on German ships who didn't know that the war had started yet because their communications weren't as good. So the increasing shift of state ambitions, economic power, and the political power that comes from mastery of information, control of information, manipulation, analysis, and deployment of information suggests, I think, that we're going to see sort of that geoeconomics moving into cyberspace is going to change an awful lot. And it may be in this dimension that we'll see whether the maritime geopolitical strategies that have dominated the last 300 years continue in the 21st century to enjoy more success than their competitors.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, for your mega historic overview in time span of 10 minutes. Ben, you've been waiting so long. Ben.
My congratulations to Asan on this big anniversary. This is really a unique global event, and it's an honor to be back, so thank you, Choi. Given the theme of this session, I thought I'd start with some words from one of the founding architects of the post-war liberal order. This is from President Truman's January 20th, 1949 inaugural address. This is what he said, quote unquote, "Today marks the beginning of a period that will be decisive for us and for the world. It may be our lot to bring about a major turning point in the long history of the human race. In company with 16 free nations of Europe, we have launched the greatest cooperative economic program in history, the Marshall Plan is referring to. The purpose of that unprecedented effort is to invigorate and strengthen democracy in Europe so that the free people of that continent can resume their rightful place in the forefront of civilization and can contribute once more to the security and welfare of the world. Fast forward 68 years to the inaugural address of Donald J. Trump, January 20th, 2017, and I quote, "From this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. From this moment on, it's going to be America first." Pretty stark contrast in the approach to geoeconomics. I think, like Walter, I was a bit surprised at the description of this session, which indicated that geoeconomics is, quote unquote, anathema to the liberal international order, which is based on delinking ideological national security and political issues from economics and trade. President Truman and his predecessor, President Roosevelt, were clearly engaged in geoeconomics, in constructing what we now call the post-war liberal order. And importantly, that strategy actually shifted in the early years after the war. If you consider the multilateral institutions that the United States created, all of them, between 1945 and 1949, the ones that were created earliest, the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, and the GATT, were based on FDR's so-called one world vision, that the United States would march into the post-war era hand in hand with the Soviet Union. There would be a cooperative relationship. By mid-1947, this vision is finished. The Truman administration moves quite consciously into a two-world vision. There's the free democratic world led by the United States, and then there's the slave world, as it was often called, led by the Soviet Union. And the institutions that are created thereafter are based on that two-world vision. In particular, two offshoots of the Marshall Plan, the European Union and NATO. So there's clearly a shift in geoeconomic approach. Importantly, however, there is an important common emphasis in both of those strategies, and that is a focus on multilateralism and alliances. And this isn't some sort of a kumbaya vision. This is very much geostrategy, and let me give you some background to explain where this comes from. At the end of the fighting in Europe in May of 1945, President Truman's been president for all of 1 month. He has no intention of overthrowing the foreign policy architecture that FDR had established for the post-war world. He is absolutely committed to FDR's pledge in Tehran in 1943 to withdraw American troops from Europe within 2 years of the end of the fighting. There are over 3 million American troops in Europe at the end of the fighting, and he begins withdrawing them immediately because the American people will not tolerate a long occupation of the European continent. By 1946, this creates huge problems for the American military establishment because Stalin shows that he's not going to be satisfied with his new expanded borders and security buffer in Eastern Europe. He begins pressing territorial claims in Turkey and Iran. He refuses to withdraw troops from Iran. He only backs down when President Truman sends a large military flotilla. But the American military establishment begins looking for ways to leverage American power without having to rely on the military. And this is where they come to the epiphany about the possibility of using geoeconomics. And in 1947, the United States is at the apex of its economic dominance. More dominant than it's ever been or ever will be. It accounts for half of all world manufacturing output. And the military, again, these ideas behind the Marshall Plan did not come from economists, although economists typically have the best ideas. They came from the military. That is that the United States would lever its economic dominance in a form of asymmetric warfare in order to counter the Soviet conventional force military superiority in Europe in order to defend its vital economic and security interests in Western Europe. So this is geoeconomics in pursuit of a larger geostrategy, which we now happen to call the post-war liberal order. Now, fast forward to the early Cold War years, and you see that this thinking is still very much alive. NAFTA, for example, was not just about trade and economics. It had a geopolitical purpose, in particular, materially improving political relations between the United States and Mexico so we could begin cooperating in important areas like security. And I think it's been enormously successful in that regard. Likewise, TPP had an important geostrategic purpose. That was for the United States and its friends in Asia to establish norms in the region that would prevent China from dominating through sheer force of size. Now, clearly, fast forward to today, and the Trump administration has a very different foreign economic doctrine. Where better to turn to understand that doctrine than to Donald Trump's Twitter feed? And here is what he tweeted 1 week ago on April 17th, which I think is very telling. He says, "While Japan and South Korea would like us to go back into TPP, I don't like the deal for the United States. Too many contingencies and no way to get out if it doesn't work. Bilateral deals are far more efficient, profitable, and better for our workers. Look how bad WTO is to the United States." Now, there's so much I disagree with in this short tweet, but I just want to focus on one narrow area of it, and that is the way he miscalculates with regard to Japan. Japan has made clear that it has no intention of doing a bilateral trade deal with an America First bully, with a gun to its head in the form of steel tariffs that are supposedly implemented to protect American national security, when Japan is supposed to be one of our most important and reliable allies in the world. Japan has absolutely no interest in doing such a deal and will not make concessions on that basis. However, Japan has indicated that it would make concessions to the United States if the United States would come back to TPP and the old geostrategic vision which Japan and the United States used to be wedded to. And I think that is very significant. And I would end with a broader point, that President Trump believes that multilateralism and alliances, maybe these were appropriate strategies in the early post-war years, but they're not appropriate today. We've given away too much. I would argue that it's entirely the reverse, given that the United States is inevitably entering a period of relative economic decline, given that Japan and other large developing nations are growing so rapidly. It is more important than ever geostrategically to the United States to leverage its soft power, the attraction of its traditional values that have had global appeal: democracy, freedom, human rights, free enterprise. These are elements of soft power that China doesn't possess. And it's not surprising that China doesn't have the option of this sort of soft power. So again, I would argue that those elements of geostrategic thinking in the early post-war years are even more relevant to the United States today and the current environment.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. I think we studied a bit late, so we have still more time after second rounds among panelists, I'll go to the floor. I have few questions to all the panel, so you may respond selectively. I think we have several very important questions. One is, as Yukiko mentioned, also Benn mentioned, Japan apparently seems not interested in accepting bilateral FTA request by Donald Trump on the grounds that Japan is stick to cause of regionalism, multilateralism. But if you really think about it, I don't really believe that might be the case. So I'd like to hear from Yukiko's your own view, why Japan is resisting. Perhaps it's not related to they want to go back to TPP, but some domestic political reason. And also the other panelists may jump in, but obviously the new US administration, they're driven by some quote and unquote misguided belief they can rely on their power only. So they try to use on bilateralism. It's very funny, ironic, because the economic power is getting smaller and smaller. So as Ben mentioned, they could have utilized multilateralism and alliance, but somehow looks like they are giving up those. So, and how long will it take Mr. Trump to realize it is time to back to go all the days and so on? So those are one set of questions. Second set of questions is China issues. Yukon mentioned services of forgotten territory. It's quite right. And so a lot of people are saying that the reason why US is willing to go to the war with China is they have hidden intention opening up China service sectors. But one thing I heard repeatedly from my friends in Beijing and Shanghai is they're not, China as a country, they don't want to repeat the same mistake like Korea was doing. Because in 1990, Korea was opening up financial service sectors in accession to OECD and so on, but there was a lot of afterthought, it may be too haphazardly did. So China is not willing to go all the way to open up financial service sector, even if that is not making its ambition of renminbi as global currency. So I'd like to hear from especially Yukon, what is your view on this? And last not but the least, one thing we didn't mention is, in this geoeconomics, unlike 70 years of liberal economic order, now we tend to see older days, old days, as long as among airlines, where US believe we belong to the same group, then if you have economic problem or trade problem, then we can go to the end and to resolve those issues without impairing security concern. But looks to me that is upside down. For instance, currency is another example. Donald Trump, along with other US administration, he is constantly blaming country like China or Japan, currency manipulators. And he is willing to use some other non-economic means to make it happen for his currency-related issues. So I think this is some untalkable issues. So I'd like to hear from the panelists. So who will go first? Yukiko, you want to take off?
Okay. In terms of TPP, I think in terms of economy, I think we'll be able to make greater concessions, even a bilateral negotiation with the US. But one of the important issues is many people has been saying that America first is not necessarily the American alone. And the TPP is a kind of collective bargain against the a kind of emerging powers. So if you are ready to go alone just bilaterally with the China, well, you have to do it. But the question is whether it should be better to have a collective bargaining with the similar countries like Australia and Japan saying that you can't control the movement of data, you can't intervene into the exchange rate, you can't protect your intellectual property rights, etc. So you have to have some investor state dispute settlement kind of mechanism. So that's the questions. And in terms of TPP, I think, well, the LDP in Japan is trying to still maintain the agricultural protectionism. And Japan is the largest importer of food, meat, feed, or soybeans, or whatever. So trying to make the best use of it, we have to let the Australia, Canada compete with the US. And in that way, we've been quite successful after the mad cow diseases in the US. So on one hand, we must be somewhat ready to have a greater concessions for the US, but we really don't want to use it right away because we have a kind of scary sense against the ideas of combining the security logic and the economic bargaining at the same time. And we are pretty much dependent on the US power anyway in terms of security. So, so that's the way we've been constantly pushing the ideas that collective bargaining is good for you, or even for the United States. And that's one thing. And on the other hand, recently, since so in that sense, I think Japan is now trying to make time until we can persuade or have some common ideas with Mr. Trump saying that collective bargaining might be working better for us, for both of us. But, well, maybe it can be very difficult to do. So then I think in the end, we have to be more serious on the FTA, but in a very different format. So we have an experience of trade war against the US already in 1980s. Still, Mr. Trump seems to have a quite vivid memory of it, but our presence is totally different. So I think new forms of trade pact is the second line that we can give in against the US.
Thank you. Peter?
I just want to make a brief comment on this issue of multilateral versus bilateral FTAs from Trump's perspective, and I don't know what's going on inside the man's head, but reading sort of his public statements, and Ben, I think you really brought up one of the good current ones from the Twitter feed. I think whereas most previous American presidents, starting in the post-World War II era, saw trade agreements as a way of strengthening important alliances, I think Trump actually sees trade agreements as a way he can kind of extract rents from strategic allies. I think the logic is sort of exactly the opposite of traditional American foreign policy. And so Trump wants these bilateral agreements rather than multilateral because he looks in this region, sees Korea, Japan, other countries dealing with a rising China, dealing with a North Korea, where they really want, as countries here in Asia, an American strategic backing, and he says if I have bilateral agreements, I can extract some rents from these strategic allies. And I think that may be a deeply misguided and not useful view from an American perspective, but I think it is the perspective that our administration is going to have for the duration of the Trump administration. So I think it's kind of a reality that will be with us. And I think I'll leave it at there.
Walter?
Yeah, just on this same point, I think it's important to understand that the politics of trade agreements in the United States are very bad. And so, from the standpoint of a lot of people, sort of ordinary voters in the U.S., Bill Clinton was elected in 1992 running against NAFTA and the WTO and ended up backing them both. And that you think about it, in 1992, the United States had two candidates for president, the world statesman George H.W. Bush, who had won the Gulf War, and then a charismatic, inexperienced governor from Arkansas who thought the U.S. should do less with foreign policy and focus more on home, and Clinton wins. In 2000, you have Al Gore, the international statesman, who has been involved in all the foreign policy work of the Clinton administration, defeated by a governor of Texas without a lot of international experience, but people kind of like him, and he says he'll do less foreign policy and no nation building. And then in 2008, you have John McCain, the great leader of the American foreign policy establishment, revered in many ways in both parties. And then this charismatic ex-state senator from Illinois, who says we should do less with foreign policy. We need to focus at home. And so in 2016, we have a former Secretary of State at the heart of the establishment, and then this guy, a real estate developer from Queens. And so the pattern is clear. American voters have picked the presidential candidate ever since the end of the Cold War who was less focused on this world-creating, world-sustaining foreign policy. And what they keep getting is the opposite. So Trump, to some degree, has to perform the theater of anti-globalism simply to reassure a base that's grown very cynical. Now, what the establishment really never did was learn how to communicate all of the values of multilateralism, all of the to the average person, and also didn't think hard enough about the ways in which not everyone was benefiting, and so on and so forth. And actually, if you read a lot of things that people say in defense of the last 20 years, they'll say that actually the relative decline in American power and wealth is actually not a bug of the system, but a feature. Because the idea was to spread economic development and make people richer in other countries to make the world more stable and more prosperous, which might be a very good argument. I wouldn't be the one wanting to try to explain it to a group of unemployed steel workers in Ohio, that we deliberately screwed you and made them rich because it's for the greater good. So, what has to happen, I think, in the United States is a combination of rethinking the geoeconomic strategy for new conditions, and then ways to learn again how to communicate the advantage of a mutually enriching process, help people understand better the connection between American security and American economic policy. But to do that, the establishment has to recover a lot of lost ground of legitimacy, and I'm afraid we're sort of paying a price. We're all paying a price. Enjoy.
I didn't know Mr. Trump studied the domestic history so much. Yukon?
Yeah, I would make some observations. Economists have done a terrible job in trying to explain trade, the benefits of trade, to a public audience. After spending decades on this, I basically come to the conclusion that it's not possible. Okay? I don't think it's possible. You basically have to get leaders with advisors who understand it. You cannot expect an ordinary person to understand this issue. It's hopeless. This issue of bilateral versus multilateral, the fundamental point is trade is a multilateral issue. It's not a bilateral issue. If you're sitting there trying to debate whether it should be looked at as a bilateral trade treaty or bilateral, it's hopeless because there's no logic in that. The best outcome, if you had it, would be a U.S. participating in TPP, shaping global standards, and inviting China to join. Because then you put the leverage on China to shape its policies consistent with the global order. That would be the ideal solution.
Invitation was already made to China.
Okay, but just think how far we're away from that ideal solution. We're way away from that. Yeah. Your question about services, financial, China's offered to open up its financial sector. China's offered to open up its auto sector. By that it means you can come in without joint ventures. You can come here on its own. Why do they offer the auto sector? Because the auto sector joint ventures offers more to foreign partners than it does to Chinese. So GM and Ford are making a fortune in China. And if they had the choice, they would choose, in fact, to have a joint venture partner, not to get out. Okay? In financial services, China fully realizes that its nature of its financial system today is such it doesn't have to worry about foreign competition anymore. It's actually leapfrogged ahead in terms of the structure of its financial services beyond the West. Everyone in China is paying through their iPhones. They skip the credit card. They skip the checks. They've linked their social and payment system and e-commerce together in a way that the West is generations behind. Okay? There's a tremendous amount to be gained, actually, by having foreigners come in, because there are aspects, of course, that China is not capable of. So this is a sector where China says, I want foreigners to come in now. I realize that the game has changed. Now let me go back to what structurally is the funny issue. If you look at America, Trump, the issue is jobs are really important to President Trump. And manufacturing is what he sees as a solution. Now the reality is that only 8% of the jobs in America are in manufacturing. 85% is in services. 55% of that 85% is high-value services. So America's future, and in fact its strengths, lies in high-value services. Manufacturing is not the issue. Having said that, the numbers of people employed in manufacturing in the US has increased in absolute numbers every year for the last 5 years. And the absolute numbers of people in China employed in manufacturing has declined every year in the last 5 years. Because China all of a sudden realizes that the key is growth in services. Okay? So here we are having a dialogue where one country realizes that services needs to be promoted, another one is trying to cling back to the manufacturing. So I find that the difficulty of this dialogue is you're beginning with assumptions which are so radically different and some, from one perspective, totally illogical. How do you bridge it? How do you bridge it analytically? And how do you get the population to buy onto it? That's why I play with pictures. Because in my book, I show with pictures why trade is multilateral rather than bilateral, and you don't have to know any economics, because that's our challenge. We can't explain this to poppies. Why is it that people think that American companies invest too much in China, and therefore American workers lose jobs? So how much of America's foreign investment goes to China of the total? America is the #1 investor in the world. The answer is 1.5%. Only 1.5% of America's foreign investment is in China. The other 98.5% go elsewhere. So the funny thing is, Americans think that American companies invest too much in China. It's actually the opposite. American companies invest too little in China. Then you contrast this with Europe. Why is it Europeans invest multiples more? And there are actually economic reasons that explain this. But as economists, we don't do it well. So we're totally unable to influence the dialogue on technology transfer, foreign investment, or trade. And we can't get this point across to the average person. That's why we're in this predicament today.
Thank you. Ben, could you briefly respond?
Briefly, I'm torn as to whether to be pessimistic or optimistic going forward on trade. My main reason for pessimism is that Donald Trump has defined the size of America's trade deficit as a sort of indicator of his political virility. And the trade deficit is going up over the next few years because the budget deficit is going to soar. And broadly speaking, for every $100 increase in the budget deficit, the trade deficit goes up by about $35. So it's going up. So that's a reason to be pessimistic. A reason to be optimistic is because it's not just Donald Trump who doesn't understand currency manipulation. Nobody does. There's a reason why the IMF came several years before the GATT. And that's that Harry Dexter White on the American side, Keynes on the British side.
Who's on the American side and not the Russian?
A more interesting historical parallels. They decided to start with currency because the public didn't understand it. And so it had less political sensitivity. Likewise, with currency manipulation, the dollar has declined over the course of Donald Trump's tenure so far. Broadly, over the past few years, China's been far more concerned with making sure that its currency doesn't plummet. It's imposed new capital controls, et cetera, than the opposite. But I could actually imagine TPP being revived under the veil of an anti-currency manipulation agreement. That is, we could force Japan and Korea, when Korea comes in under duress, to sign a pledge never, ever, ever to manipulate its currency that no one will understand. It would be totally unverifiable. And Donald Trump can therefore tell the American public that he has fixed the big underlying flaw behind TPP. Those cheating foreign...
Kudlow about this?
No comment.
Yeah.
and there are people in the administration who understand this possibility. So it's not beyond imagination that something as stupid as currency manipulation could be the savior of a massive trade agreement.
Well, whether or not the currency manipulation discussion is saving trade deficit issue is another. But from this corner of the world, that we have a growing number of Korean scholars, not only Korean scholars, but internet scholars, who tend to view that this currency manipulation discussion is very much, unfairly tilted the ground, because USA is having the powers to keep printing the money, right? But we are on wrong side of playing ground. Well, our time is very tight, but I'll go to the floor anyway. So please raise your hands. Mike will approach to you. But don't please comment, but ask a few questions. So I'd like to collect a few questions. I don't see none, so.
It was also clear we don't have any questions.
All right, okay, so you totally
That's
understood.
because no one
Okay.
understands trade, you see.
Well, thank you very much. From this morning plenary, we came to understanding geoeconomics is absolutely not new phenomenon. It's been around for some time, but we're facing new challenges. Thank you very much, and give a big round of applause to all those panelists. Thank you.